Hey folks, hope everybody's doing well and is safe and is just working through school. I know it's been a challenge over the past few weeks, but good news is that you only have a few weeks left, so we're on the downhill slide. If anybody has hook up with a hairdresser, I could sure use one because I definitely need a haircut. So tonight we're going to be, or today in this lecture, we're going to be talking about project scheduling and construction cost management. If there was one broad principle that I want you to understand out of this particular lecture is that when we're managing architectural projects, it almost always comes down to time and money is what you're managing. Now you are obviously managing scope, you're managing quality, you're trying to fulfill your owner's design intent and program and what you want to achieve as the architect out of the project. But really it comes down to time and money. And in fact, that's because contractually, in a construction contract between an owner and a contractor, there are two main things that are set: the contract cost and the contract time. Okay, and so really that requires you to be managing both of those things, both during design and during construction. So let's delve into time. So really, there are three main tools that are used to help manage project time. And those are milestone charts, bar charts, otherwise known as Gantt charts, and critical path method. So milestone charts are really just, it's a task list, right? It's you list each individual tasks, who's doing those things and when these things are due. And oftentimes that's sufficient for, most small projects, right? It's like you're doing this, you're doing this, you're doing this, and we'll all meet here at the end. And so there's an example there in your book on page 471 that I encourage you to look at so that you can get a better visual of what that really looks like. Um, then a Gantt chart is a type of bar chart that was developed by Henry Gantt in the 19 teens and illustrates project schedule. And so for that, I'd like you to look at page 472 in your handbook. And so really what this does is it illustrates individual tasks, right? And then it can be broken down into any elements of a project and then with start and finish dates, right? So that you can see the interrelationship of each of these tasks, their duration, and their start and stop dates. Now, modern Gantt charts show the dependency of work, and those are also known as critical path method. So critical path method is pretty much what's used both by architects, internally and specifically for on the construction side where you've got so many activities occurring simultaneously. And so what these do is it's very similar to a bar chart, right? But the difference is that not only are you identifying tasks, but you begin to identify relationships between tasks so that you understand that this activity can't happen until this activity is done. And so what you can do then is you can construct each of these tasks with precedences and dependencies between the activities. And so what that allows you to do is to really look at optimal task durations and when you need to have certain things happening in order to make sure that you're not delaying a task further down the line, and ultimately defines that critical path through the project of, this has to happen before this can happen, before this can happen, before this can happen. And so that's typically what you see. And here's an example. This isn't from one of my projects. This looks like something maybe I grabbed off the internet, but I mean it's pretty typical. You see Microsoft Project is particularly used for this. A lot of the contractors' project management softwares and tools often have their own built-in critical path method type schedule. But as you can see, much like a bar chart, you've got each of these activities over here on your left. Each of these activities has a bar that's associated with it that tracks it over time, This is the time scale up here at the top, so that you can see, there's a start and an end, and then all these lines are showing the dependencies and interrelationships between each of these tasks. So you can see, I can't even read what this task is, kind of down over here. There's this little task, but clearly there's a lot of things that kind of come and pinch right down here at this point in the project. So obviously there are some really critical things that need to happen and hit dates here so that these things don't bunch up too tight and you've got to hold up in your project. And that's where this is particularly helpful, because it's kind of a visual representation of the interdependencies of the tasks, and it can help you identify where those problem areas are and what the critical path for construction or design might be. So now let's talk about project costs, construction costs, and cost estimating. So I want you to understand that there are types of facility costs, right? There's the costs to construct the facility, and then there's the costs that are assigned to the operation of the facility, or things that are outside of the actual construction of the project, right? And so sometimes we're often asked to think about things like the operation and maintenance cost of in subsequent years over the project life cycle. That includes the cost of the land, what it costs to operate, labor and materials for maintenance and repairs, periodic renovations of the facility. I mean, you haven't even constructed it, and yeah, you need to think about, okay, well, what does a renovation cycle look like? Insurance and taxes, financing costs, utilities, and other owner expenses. So when an owner is looking at a project, it's not just the construction costs that they're zeroed in on, but they're thinking about all of these other things. Sorry about that. And then, yeah, so the cost of the money, it needs to be included, because you've got the money that they're borrowing. Sorry, that's my dog in the background. You cost of the money, and it costs money to lend money or to borrow the money. So you've got to factor that in. Insurance and taxes during construction. General office overhead for the owner, if they have any additional project management, or maybe they're doing construction management as advisor or something like that. So those costs need to be factored in. Equipment and furnishings, typically those aren't included in the construction cost, and so you've got the cost of equipment and furnishings, and that can be a significant cost as well. And then inspections and testing. Excuse me, in your specification, sorry, I lost my train of thought. In your project manual, there are several things that you'll have for inspections and testing. And so, certain products are concrete 28-day breaks or those things of that nature. So when it comes to construction cost estimating, I really want to focus in here on this construction costs, including materials, equipment, and labor. That's where we're going to take a deeper dive. So there are different types of construction cost estimates that I want you to be aware of. First is the order of magnitude, right? And this is a ballpark estimate. And so, as an architect, you're going to be asked all the time, hey, I want to do this building. How much is it going to cost? Well, it really comes down to, kind of experience, what you're seeing in the market, those sorts of things. Kind of a rule of thumb type thing is like, yeah, you ought to be able to do that 5,000 square foot building for about 1.2 million, probably. And so, it's not terribly accurate, but hey, you got to start somewhere, right? And this is typically performed early in the planning stages, usually prior to schematic design, before you put pen to paper. Then there are more specific ones that relate to area, volume, and other single unit rate methods. So the first one that I want to cover is like conceptual types of estimate. So this is, if you can imagine, a parking structure, a parking garage, right? And so, for instance, just a straight up parking garage is conceptually about 12 to 15,000 bucks per space, per parking space. That's just kind of the rule of thumb right now. So conceptually, you could say somebody says, hey, I want to do a 100 space parking garage. You say, well, that's probably going to be about 1.5 million. By the time you factor in everything else. So conceptually, you can kind of be able to manage that. The next thing is, and that's typically performed very early in the project. And so, conceptually, how you would approach that is you would say, all right, here are my things. I've got new building construction, some site work, a subtotal, an estimate contingency, and then my estimate of probable construction cost. So if I have 350 spaces, and then I'm figuring, $15,000 per parking space. I'm doing a lump sum of $100,000 based on the site, just a guess at this point. And so you can be able to calculate that out to be able to come out. So it's all right if you're thinking 350 spaces, you're looking at 5.8, somewhere between 5.5 and $6 million. And really, it's a simple formula: A times B equals C, right? It's just that simple. Another type of unit cost estimate is a square foot. This is usually an estimate that multiplies the cost per square foot times the floor area of that building. And these are typically based on historic data and should account for, like the project type, construction type, and site factors. And typically you just do this early on in the project schematic design, maybe design. So again, similar thing, you look at the construction cost, and then that construction cost translates down into a recommended project budget. And so when you look at that, the project budget is here. So these are some of the other costs that you can consider whenever you're looking at your estimated construction cost. The other thing I want you to note in this is that you've got that estimate contingency. So an estimate contingency, 5% is included in here. That's kind of a fudge factor, particularly if you're doing something early on in the project. You may not know all the details, what the finishes are going to be or whatever. And so, that gives you some latitude in the estimate in terms of what that might look like. And then again, you always want to recommend that the owner carry a project contingency in their overall project budget, right? 10%, boy, that would be a nice healthy contingency on their part, but that's for any unforeseen conditions. Maybe there's some subsurface, soil conditions that need to be remedied, or, here in the Ozarks, there's plenty of rock. So, there's, if you're doing a renovation of an existing building, you want to make sure your owner carries a healthy project contingency, because that can, if you're doing demolition and something is not as you expected, they've got the money set aside to be able to address that particular issue. So, again, the square foot estimate is very similar in the fact that, it's A times B equals C, right? You've got your whatever number of units you've got and the cost per unit, and that gives you the cost per each of those items. And you would carry that construction cost down to look at the project budget. And there's your contingencies again. Another unit method that you can do is an elemental method. And so this approach falls between a single unit rate method and extremely detailed quantity survey. And so what this does is it takes the building and subdivides it into the functional subsystems, right? And in that it typically includes the substructure, foundations, stuff below grade, all those sorts of things. It will include the superstructure, the steel structure or concrete structure or whatever it is that's holding it up. The enclosure, what are you wrapping it with and enclosing the building? Mechanical, plumbing, and electrical, and then interior infill. Excuse me. And the last one is a quantity survey method. And this is typically the detailed type estimate that you would do during design, development, and construction document phases. And so really what this is breaking down the building into its parts and pieces and using unit costs in order to do that. And it's set up very similarly to the square foot cost method. So during class, what I'll do is we'll go through sample in the Excel spreadsheet, because this also ties into your project 3 assignment. So we'll dive in more into that. And then last but not least is when you're doing construction cost estimates, is don't forget about the general contractor's fees. So you have a subtotal for the construction cost, and then typically you'll want to add in costs that are associated with the general conditions of the contract. So these are things like the porta potties on site, the site enclosure fence, the erosion and soil control during construction. There are all these things that have to take place that actually are part of the construction process, but aren't part of the building. And so those are what are considered the general conditions. Renting of maybe some equipment, general cleaning during construction, those sorts of things. And then you've got the general contractor's overhead and profit. Just like architects, they're not in it to do it for free just because they're nice people. Nope, they want to make money as well, and so they will have a fee for that. And then performance bond. We've talked about surety, and if there's a performance bond included in there, those costs will need to be included as well. And so you come up with a subtotal and then an estimate contingency, like we talked about, your kind of fudge factor. And so then you can have estimated construction costs. The last type of estimate that I want to go through is division by the CSI divisions, by the Construction Specifiers Institute divisions. And so what this does is it breaks it down by each of these divisions. I don't know if you can see my pointer on the recording, but you've got each of the specification divisions, like we talked about in one of our lectures. And then, you've got the values that are there. And for each of those line items, it's broken down. So for instance, here's division 4 for some of the masonry, right? And so you would have the quantity of the masonry, the unit of square feet, the cost per that unit, and then the total unit price. And then that is carried over back to that main sheet where it tallies by CSI division. So when we meet on Monday, I'll address any questions you might have. I've been asked to make sure we've got the chat function on Zoom so that folks can type in questions that they might have, or if there's something specific that you want me to cover that you think of while you're watching this, feel free to shoot me an email, and that's something that I can be sure and be prepared for when we meet. So thanks again for your time, and see you guys Monday.